Welcome to Adopting Zero Trust, or AZT, a podcast designed to provide context behind current challenges in the world of cybersecurity. Your hosts, Elliot, Volkman, and Neal provide this platform to elevate important conversations, to drive action, and share the good word about the concept of zero trust. Now, on to your hosts.
Hello, and welcome back to Adopting Zero Trust. I am Elliot Volkman, your producer, alongside our wonderful host, Mr. Neal Dennis. And today, we are going to talk about a topic that we have realistically avoided like the plague for the last 3-4 years now, which is around incidents and breaches. Now, not specifically talking about any particular thing that you might have seen in the headlines, but more philosophical, strategic kind of shaping. Let's go with that. But for that, we have a perfect guest to be able to speak to that, which is Mr. Ian Branson, who is the Vice President of Global Industrial Cybersecurity for Black and Veatch, and has a pretty long history being in the cybersecurity world, is in particular for critical infrastructure. Ian, did I get that right? Did I miss anything? Otherwise, we're just going to start peppering you with some questions because I'm sure our audience is going to be pretty interested to hear your perspective.
Well, thank you for having me on, and you got it right. So I'm ready to answer what you're asking.
I tend to have a terrible history of messing up names, even if they're like Neal. But, so we'll go for that. So I'm just going to throw out one pretty basic question is maybe like this is going to be conversation shaping. You have to protect some of the most important infrastructure in the world. Where do we start? What do we have to worry about on day one?
Well, that's a great question. When you're talking about where you begin is actually it's one of the basic questions my clients are asking us right now, because there's been a shift. This has been an area for critical infrastructure and cyber has been emerging. When you're talking about things like safety and uptime, it's always been changing. And that question that you just asked is the number one question I get at this point, which is what now? It used to be, I don't know if this is really a thing. Our critical infrastructure is protected. We've got things like air gaps, yada, yada, yada. There's different types of things that people are trying to say that why they shouldn't do something. That was probably about 8 years ago. I've actually had them sit down and look at me and tell me I was making up cyber to sell them stuff. And so that was a little rough. But that's not the case anymore. Okay. They're asking us now, there has been enough incidents, there has been enough warning signs, warning bells, if you will, out there that that's no longer the question. The question or statements are now, what now or where do I begin? And usually we try to break it down very simply. Ask the very simple questions at the beginning. Do you know what you need to protect, right? Asset inventory, asset management, it's usually where you begin. But again, when I'm talking to usually the boards of directors or senior folks, I don't use words like asset inventory. I just say, do you know what you need to protect, right? Do you know what's out there? And in the OT or operational technology side of this equation, the stuff that we're protecting is that, all that equipment that makes operations run. All the things that can go boom, okay, if a bad guy gets in there. Well, we say, well, do you know what's in there? And more often than not, more often, they do not. They don't have the strong asset inventory. So then I said, well, then you can't answer the second question. The second question is, do you know where your holes are? Vulnerability assessment, vulnerability management, all that type of stuff that you would go in those OT environments. Well, you can't answer the second one if you can't answer the first one. And then you can't answer all the other ones. Like, hey, can you tell if someone's in there? Can you get them out? We try to put this in terms that are much more pragmatic and less technical and show the actual impact, things that impact, like I said, safety and uptime, which is what is reshaping this environment today.
I certainly appreciate that, and thank you for making that a less technical answer because the folks who live within our community, they are pretty technical minded, and I think their ability to translate this for their executives and the boards usually beneficial. I am kind of curious. So I think to your point, you're correct. There's definitely been a turn of like adoption and understanding and the value, but organizations definitely are still like begging for dollars to support these efforts. I'm curious if you feel like they have to feel the pain themselves, or if there's any particular areas where you've seen that have helped smooth that over for their boards.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, when you're talking about, hey, how do I fund this? Where do I get my resources and authorities to go do stuff? That's That's usually also when they're asking the what now question, they're saying, how do I get money to get this done? Where do we begin? Where do I do, how to justify it? Because usually they're having the rose pinned on them by a board of directors. This is usually like a top 3 priority, but they get some mandate like make us safe. Okay. Keep things running. And you're like, fabulous. And if they're on the IT, if it's the CISO who's doing it and they have to go onto a job site where things can really be impacted, they might get thrown out, right? The site managers on that will go in and they might chuck them out, right? Because I don't want your IT stuff in our OT, and there's all sorts of that type of challenge. So it gets back to this resourcing, where to your question is, so how do I get my resources and authorities? So when they ask us for assessments, and that's where you begin, because you have to prioritize your risks and where you're going. We're saying what you're doing is you're making your business case. Okay. Again, one of the mistakes you'll make, a technical audience will appreciate this. You go in with all the technical things that you need to do. Man, we've done the scans, we've got out there, and then you go to the senior executives, and they're just staring at you like, I don't understand like 5 words that you just said. But if you try to say, look, this is what it means to make us safe and keep us running, and you make that business case backwards, and here's our priority areas, and I put this against our process safety, and I put this against in terms that they understand and can relate to risk management, okay, then they start to understand. So part of this, when you talk about unlocking the financial part of this, where I've seen it successful, is being able to do that. Put it in a risk equation. It is probability of it's going to happen, and its impact is what's going to happen. And you're trying to limit both those sides. So you take certain measures to limit the access and the probability that something bad is going to happen, right? And there's a whole bunch of stuff you're supposed to do on that side of the equation. And then you're going to assume they're going to get in at some point, because that's the only guarantee I can give anyone, is that someone's going to get in at some point. So when it goes on the other side, all those capabilities, the monitoring, incident response, that kind of stuff, limits the impact. So you have a classic bow tie kind of risk equation. That's important when you're trying to get money, right? What did someone tell me? It was a great statement. He said, bang the risk register until money comes in. Okay. Talk about risk, go into that area and put this as business risk of what you're doing. Because again, unlike IT, which is important stuff, and it's all integrated into one concept. But when you start moving towards a consequence-driven model, safety and uptime are the 2 top priorities. That tends to get more attention and understand more traction. And again, it's depending on the client. I've had clients that, man, they get it. Maybe they've been attacked. Maybe they just get someone who really understands how to articulate it, or they get someone on the board who really understands it. And they'll get fully funded in that sense. Okay, we get this. We're going to put this in operational budget. We're going to make it part of CapEx. We're going to make it part of these other types of areas of daily running of business, okay, daily running of operations, just like any other risk to operations. And then we have other places who say, no, we're going to stuff it only in the IT budget, which we're always going to be shrinking, and then we're going to kick it out, and then we're going to hope that things don't happen. Clearly, hope is not a plan, but is, something that we need to address. And it's moving. Like I said, it's changing, and it's more client by client, like person by company by company, than it is from like a whole sector that's changing.
Yes, I think it's fun. You touch base on stuff that I preach all the time, which is loosely around requirements. So I come from an Intel background. And so for me, whenever I do things, doesn't matter IT, OT side of the fence, but whenever I do anything, whether it's procurement, whether it's resource management assessments, whether it's requesting for things to do other things, whatever that may be. For me, everything needs to map back to some kind of requirement, whether it's an Intel requirement or business risk management requirement, stuff like that. Ultimately, that's where my goal is to get to, like you're mentioning. If I can tie a dollar sign to this, then typically speaking, you have a much better job of getting that smaller dollar sign to mitigate the larger dollar sign becoming a reality. Hopefully, not always. So for me, that's part and parcel. And so for those of us out there, just from my perspective, I think it's a fair reminder. If you're coming from IT going over to the OT fence to do things, or OT going to the IT, doesn't really matter. Or if you're getting started and you're wondering where to go, if you have an Intel analyst on your team somewhere, ask them what their requirements are. Get them to help you build requirements into the OT environment, because they probably already know the business risks, in theory. And if they don't, then it's probably because all they're being told to do is research for the SOC and be a little PowerPoint jockey, unfortunately. So let's elevate them. That's a different foot stomp. But no, that's fun. So I also worked on the OT side of the fence for a small spell for about 4 or 5 years. It's been a long time. And I worked in it during the time frame where IoT was a newer thing and nobody cared about either of them from a security perspective.
Yeah.
Since I know nobody from my power company listening, my power meter out here in the Zigbee is still open, just FYI, guys. So that being said, I think it's fun. I think it's great grassroots way to do things. And you're right, getting things to the dollars, getting things to the business risk, and letting the leadership know if this goes down, this is $1 million. But if you let me protect it, it only costs you 50 grand or 100 grand a year. Stuff like that. Gets the right point across. I'm going to give Elliot one more question before I take over a little bit more, because I feel like he's got one more in his coffers there.
I don't know why you would think that. I mean, I'm going to probably just totally derail the piece, but the threat intel side, I think, is actually something I would love to pull on, because when it comes to incidents and preparing for that and continuity, I think the challenge is, like, in the world, we see endless amounts of CVEs and vulnerabilities pop up. But I'm curious if you feel like there needs to be a really clear and direct conversation about using intelligence versus just getting the fire hose of information out there and helping shape continuity and concerns around that. 'Cause you already flagged the keywords for me, which were highlighting impact versus probability. But I don't know, maybe that's the piece where I'm heading towards with unlocking it with threat intelligence and
definitely
actually
unlocked the
shaping
can,
in
didn't
reality.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's also a great one, because when you talk about threat intelligence, it means so much to so many people. Do I just gonna do a insert of, recent attacks as far as the hashtags or whatever they're trying to put in, or am I trying to see what the threat actors are doing, or what we're trying to go from, what does this all mean? And from my background, I also have some intel community background. I think about things as raw intelligence and finished intelligence. And finished intelligence is something for which I can take actionable intelligence. You can tell me what's going on and then what I'm supposed to do, about this. And so you go back and say, well, what are the sources? Well, actually, you go back to your requirements and say, what do I need to know? What are my risk factors? What do I need to look at to sort through all that information that's out there? And then you go, that sets your requirements, going, okay, this is where we're going to go. You collect that against those, and you get it, and you refine it, because there's too much of this stuff, like you had mentioned, lots of alerts, lots of stuff coming in. Data is not intelligent. Data is data. Okay. You actually have to synthesize that data, do sense making out of that data, patterning off that data, and even predictiveness off that data, and so that you can apply that data, right? So you can turn that into finished intelligence. And so there is a correlation between how intelligence tradecraft, if you will, or if other types of things, when people are trying to get lots of information and go take action on it, and use those models, right? That happens in other places like financial modeling and other places. Don't just think about this as a technical equation. Think about this as a problem set, and you work from the end result, that end goal. I want to have this protected. I want to have this impact reduced, or this probability, or this ability to impact that probability that someone's going to get in, and work backwards, right? That's how you need to filter through, in my opinion, most of what's out there, because threat intelligence, like I said, it's like saying whatchamacallit. It's just a word at some point when they throw so much data and not enough useful data, and no one is converting it to actual intelligence. And that's how we certainly try to promote the topic of threat intelligence.
And I think it's Elliot pushed this one out there on purpose. I know he did. But also, I love that I'm not going to argue with the daggum thing you said about it, because it's spot on. Awesome. Thank you. It's like you understand the principle of the thing. It's beautiful. The other fun thing I like to think about, so when I go into organizations, or when I've been brought in to help consult or stand up things, if there is an OT IT world for them. So from my background, the more recent stuff has been with payment systems and those embedded devices, more so than control systems.
Got it.
A little bit on the control systems, because everybody wants to pay attention to what their air conditioner is doing, courtesy of someone else's big red target reach. But things are what they are, right? So thinking about the teams, and you kind of alluded to this earlier on, the OT guys, the guys actually sitting on the floor, and what they're doing, what are they monitoring, what are they tracking. And for those who don't understand the OT side of the fence, uptime, that the availability of that service is critical to almost anything else. It doesn't matter how corrupted it is, typically, as long as the job is getting done and the data is being captured to report back, everything else is circumstantial at that point. And then safety is number 2, but I would argue sometimes it falls in pretty low at some places, as long as the machines are machining. But one thing I like to try to coach, one thing I love, is trying to figure out ways to marry the OT IT side of the house up and teach people to use their own data, right? Their own sensors as potential intel before even looking at a large data set like a CrowdStrike, Mandiant, pick a flavor, whatever they are. Not to say that you still shouldn't. You need supplemental. You need people who understand the verticals that are impacting you before they get to you. But trying to educate people on how to merge the two disciplines from an intel perspective and just from a security perspective, that's a whole nother journey. So my curiosity question to you, still in the intel vein, but loosely, when we start going into these organizations, and like you mentioned, the IT guy shows up and then gets booted out because he forgot to wear a hard hat. How do you help educate both at the leadership level and then at that department leader level that these two things need to have some kind of intentful crossover and more of a global or strategic process flow?
So the IT OT convergence, if you will, and the importance of the two. You're also doing that in a dynamic environment where on the OT side, they're still understanding what all this digitalization is and what it means to them. I mean, everything's getting more and more connected. You had mentioned IIoT, so you got lots of drones and stuff running around on operation sites. You're getting things that are being connected that were never built to be connected. Okay, so there's a really different environment in that OT space, in that operational technology space, because, if you take a look at something like a turbine, right, that's producing electricity, those things last like, 40 years? And so they've just been putting different kinds of technology in there, as you mentioned, to keep things up and running, right? And so one of the things, depending on which audience you're talking to, you have to say, first of all, this whole distinction of IT and OT is that whole Purdue model collapsing. All that stuff is getting meshed together, if you will, because you can have an IT attack, have an OT consequence, and, Colonial Pipeline, right? IT attack, but they shut down oil for it, right? And so it's about the consequence. And I think consequence-driven cyber is going to start reshaping most of what we're talking about. Because, again, boards of directors I talk to wouldn't know a DMZ or tell you the difference between IT and OT, and Purdue in their world is, people who make chicken. So, that's not in their experience. But they do know the consequence. Uptime, safety, and then IP and all that starts getting melded together. But as things get also more connected and things get more consequence driven and this OT area starts becoming more prominent, it all starts meshing together. So we're all going to have to figure out how that works together. And there's data on both sides of those. And you mentioned one other point that I want to make sure we highlight, a concept called data meshing that we talk about, which is there's OT data. So there's OT cyber data. So I'm going to look at all the cyber stuff and we're going to look at, packets and frequency and the communication stuff on the wire. Okay. But there's a huge amount of operational data that is also being generated, collected, synthesized, AI applied to it, etc. But there's not always having those mesh with the cyber data. So you got IT, you've got OT cyber, we have physical security stuff and data and information from there, and then we have operational. You have all these pockets, and you had mentioned, Neal, about, hey, let's look at our information first before we go out and threat intelligence and the whole wide world. We got a treasure trove of stuff here that is very specific to how we operate and how this impacts safety, uptime, and then the other types of risks and priorities that you have. So when it comes back to your point about, hey, how do we convey this? You need to show that this is all coming together, okay? And don't worry about which network it came on or whatever. We're talking about consequences. So let's keep it simple. Things are getting complex. Let's simplify. Okay, it's about these consequences. Okay, 2, we've got all this kind of data. We don't have to go outside. We want to supplement with outside as reference. I get that. But man, we got to get our homegrown data in here and figure out what's going on, because it gives us insights to what's happening with us on what we're doing. And then the last piece is just appreciating that even though they're coming together, they are different environments. So you just want to know how to work on that and speak the language. You talked about uptime. That is absolutely right. It's such a huge point in operations. So there's like a cultural change. There's a technology difference. The networks are different. So you do want to have an appreciation for that. So, I mean, when you boil it all down, it is, understanding your own data, doing consequence-driven cyber, and then appreciating the differences. Those would be the 3 areas that I would say, hey, focus on that as these things are coming together.
Can I be you when I grow up? No, that's wonderful. I mean, that's a very wonderful way of saying all that. So that's perfect. Like, I really honestly don't have much to say on top of any of that. So that's beautiful. It's the point of getting it across is trying to get that education factor around all that. And to your point, convergence and pushing back on the data side. So as that secondary step here, I think once you realize how to get access to the information, which is a big thing, it's hard. There's whichever side you're coming from the coin, but hopefully at most of these larger companies, there's at least someone performing some kind of security duty, physical, digital. And I'm going to digress slightly because you mentioned physical security as well. So I'm going to come back to that in a sec. Because need to take a note so I can remember my brain here. So the convergence, and then someone doing hopefully security on both sides of the coin, but the guy doing OT security is probably more focused on the ingress egress in those 1 or 2 little spots and not monitoring things post and pre too much in my experience. And then, once we get in there and we start putting things in line to monitor stuff behind the actual firewalls and stuff, that's where you start finding fun stuff typically. But I think it's fun. One of the excuses I got for that at one point was, well, one, it was a warehouse factory type setup, and the whole construct manufacturing of some sort, and then processing the packaging into some kind of delivery system. So production all the way into delivery, right through to the warehouse end. And we went in there and the guys, well, we don't have to worry about any of this stuff. Everything is, it's a holistically segregated network, and the historian is the only thing that has outbound, inbound, and everything past that is in some kind of data diode, right? Mm-hmm. And which real simple survey of everything showed probably about, I think it was like 12, 14, 15, something ridiculous amount of wireless access points on the devices that were just default state. They were things that had whether it was Zigbee, whether it was Bluetooth, whether it was actual Wi-Fi. And there's kind of a host of things because nobody had ever gone in and done like a legitimate risk assessment or even looked at the asset inventory to see what it was capable of doing. So the convergence of technology, that was what got them. These guys saying that they were secure were guys who had been working in that environment for 15, 20 years. They were used to the smaller things like the IEDs, RTUs and everything, even the PLCs all being firewalled off physically by proxy of just that's how they were designed. Like they didn't have these wireless connections. And we do a quick survey and the guy, to be fair, the dude was late 50s, early 60s, and this was 10 plus years ago. He didn't understand any of the stuff we were talking about nor how I could get access. I was like, well, when you go home and you open up your laptop or your desktop and it's not plugged in, I can do that here. And his eyes just kind of lit up. So part of the education factor, right? Like you're mentioning, as things merge.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, the myth of the air gap, I've heard it many, many times. Oh, we're just, like I said, we're walled off. We just had the DMZ. We just have the historian. That's all we have. We got it protected. Everything's great. I'm like, oh, cool. Do you have employees? Oh, you do? Oh, okay. And do you have, and how do you update all that equipment? Do you have contractors come in? Oh, we plug it into the internet once in a while and it downloads something. Oh, you plug it in, do you? Right. And so again, that's not even talking about the wireless stuff in, but you got supply chain attack. You got all these ways, and it just takes me not long to start saying, sure, you got an air gap. And that was before they're starting to connect things much more in operations now because you have a lack of a specialized labor and they want to be able to centralize. So now I'm centralizing stuff. And so I need more remote access, right? And more control. And then you have things like, oh, let's move OT to the cloud. That'd be great. And let's go start moving that up there. Well, then you got, again, you're consolidating, you're changing these equations and you're changing them in an environment where you have a legacy challenge where that means things that were never designed to be connected are now being connected. So you just need to take a pause. It's not saying you don't do it. It's happening. There are market forces that are pushing this, and those are very powerful. So they're going to happen. It's how you're going to manage it. You can stick your head in the sand and get whacked, or we can manage it along the way. So it's a business imperative and an operational reality right now to handle cyber. So let's go figure out how you do it, not if you should do it.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm going to bring us forward a little bit again. So you touched on earlier kind of the penultimate dream of security, and then a little bit on what the ultimate endpoint should be from my perspective as an Intel guy. I've been trying to discuss things around a global Intel function for companies. So where we started the journey from a private sector with getting one or two guys to support the SOC, and for the most part, they were just PowerPoint jockeys or supplemental research, not proactive, but reactive. Now we're moving into companies and entities on the IT side that understand they need to get a little more reactive. So maybe they're building a little bit bigger team, or maybe they're getting better tooling, or maybe they're becoming self-aware of their data. And OT's catching up, which is great. And because of this convergence of technology and the growth, and like you mentioned, the types of data, which I'll get to in a sec, getting to the larger goal would be, for me, Intel team that's supporting and monitoring all aspects of security, not just cyber, not just IT, not just OT, but like you mentioned, physical security. That creates a digital footprint when something happens, which makes my life less complicated. But being able to truly merge all of those disciplines, not just from an Intel perspective, but from a security perspective, into an actual legitimate fusion center, not a cyber fusion, but like what I would consider a fusion center from the government side, where you have guys from all verticals of the security world sitting there. Because I think maybe what you might have been alluding to from a physical perspective is somebody comes and knocks on a door at a warehouse or a plant or something like that, or the fence at the gas turbine generator facility, whatever. Some of those things generate notifications, alarm bells, things like that. But at the same time, that guy could have just been looking at things so he could go back home and realize that they're using Sprecher or Siemens or other weird things on site, whatever, right? Surveys, reconnoitering. So back on that, have you had a lot of exposure or a lot of people looking to truly, or at least ask questions around trying to do that more holistic merger of security from the physical to digital domain to kind of take that fusion mentality, that true fusion mentality?
So I think that when you talk about fusion, okay, in here, I do think a lot of the discussion is still cyber fusion and cyber centers, cyber. And I think that is important. Don't get me wrong. You're going in the right direction. Directionally, we're good. But more of a more omni-source type perspective. When you're talking about physical security, you're talking about operational data. We're talking about what we know about in the world about certain suppliers and supply chain risk management and what kind of intel and information you have there on open source. We're not talking about anything even that's not widely available. Okay. How you're able to integrate that information with your own information about your strategic direction or where you might want to go, et cetera. So you have all these different types of perspectives that impact, again, that consequence, going back to that consequence driven, your safety and your uptime. If you think about it just from a cyber perspective and how can I get in from a certain point, okay, and go in there and infiltrate and exploit a network, you may be missing a larger part of that story, right? Who are the threat actors? And maybe they're not part of a threat group, but they're part of another type of organization that you need to pay attention to, right? The physical security, as you mentioned, someone's going in there, maybe they're just casing the joint, I don't know. And so having that, building out that fusion, I do believe is something that is down, like that's where you want to get to. I've seen steps. So you're saying, are people like going there? I don't see a lot of we're there because of the crawl, walk, run. Hey, remember, I ask often the first question, do you know what you need to protect? And they're like, I have guys with clipboards who walk around, and that's kind of my, so yeah. You can understand that you're like, yes, that is exactly where I think, and types of perspectives that you need to bring in and how you crawl, walk, run on that area. Now, I will say about physical security, more and more, I am seeing that meshed in with cybersecurity. So at least they're taking some of those adjacent steps and putting them in, but clicking it all together in smooth, fusion center that has all the different perspectives. We're not there. I just don't see it there yet. I see directionally steps along the way and movement towards that. But getting the whole picture is powerful, right? And that helps you identify more things, shorten the time identification, validate what's noise and what's, the sound through the fury, get getting what you're supposed to get it done, and then shorten the time to reaction and time to resolution, right? That it's about understanding more. And then again, this finished intelligence, making sure that you get all that information, but you can go find information that you can go take action, do stuff with.
Yeah, I'll add one little blip. There's a few entities out there. They're more on the financial side of the house because they tend to understand the dollar sign risk a little more because that's their job. But there's a few companies that I've seen that have as near as possible to a global intel operations.
Okay.
And that tie in for everything from geopolitical aspects to travel awareness to digital. Now, that being said, they're not heavy into the OT side of the house. So the combination platter of getting all that's not fully there for them in that sense. So I think that's awesome. I'm like I said, my pipe dream at any organization I'm ever with is to have an intel organization that truly impacts the entirety of the company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the whole company, I don't care what vertical you're in or what you're producing, what you're handling, OT, IT, financial services, healthcare. I don't care. As far as I'm concerned, if you have an intel team, that intel team needs to have domain discipline across all of those aspects of what the company's doing. Getting it has definitely been more of a legitimate pipe dream, but I do agree. I think we're getting towards that layer of awareness more and more. I think, like you mentioned, the cyber fusion centers, I try to avoid that term because me personally, it makes me cringe, but it is the right word. It's not that it's not the right word. I just don't like it because coming from a government background, there's no such thing as a cyber fusion.
Use more stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the reality of how you have to brand it, right? And we talked about that at the beginning. You have to know how to sales pitch the constructs, how to tie it back into what you need to get money. And for those listening, cyber fusion is the key term from a marketing perspective to kind of help get some of those things over the hurdle. And for those who are intel driven from the government side of the house, I apologize for making you use those words. But no, that's fun. I think maybe where we're at. Yeah, maybe one last thing for me, the OT side of the house. So when you think about this need to drive towards that combined model, right? And because technology is doing it, I'm just kind of curious, once, when you're having these conversations, how many of them are driven by flat out need versus how many of them are driven out of a curiosity to avoid the need, especially living in a post pipeline and a few other issues of late, right? I mean, are you seeing a lot of potential legitimate concerns creep up now as OT becomes more of a reality for compromise across the board, or are people truly trying to be a little more preemptive in their at least attempts to secure that environment?
Right. I'm seeing, I'm going to say this in an optimistic way, I'm seeing a mix. Okay. Because before it wasn't. It was like, okay, what do I have to do? What is the cost center? Let me kick it to another person who can pay for it, et cetera. This is probably about 8 years ago. At about right about the time they were telling me I was making up cyber to sell them stuff, et cetera.
Yeah.
Then fast forward, right? You have some seminal events like I think Colonial Pipeline actually changed a lot of minds, not because it was such of the attack itself, again, an IT attack and an OT consequence, but that was like it's a warning bell for a lot of the critical infrastructure saying, oh my goodness, they could shut down a pipeline for a week. That's a real thing. And then it was a dinner bell for the bad guys who said, wait, you can shut down a pipeline for a week? That's you can see both sides of that. You can see like an increase in attack, increase of this, increase of where. And so now you're going to get a hit and miss. Some of the companies that are either had suffered some sort of attack, again, you don't always have to report, so you can't eat. Sometimes you can see it in their eyes. They're like, we need you right now, like right now. Can you come in tomorrow? And so that, or they're just being more proactive on it because they're understanding what's going on and they understand the difference between compliance and security. You can be compliant, fully compliant, not very secure. We got to actually build this in a way that manages our risk properly. Seeing it a lot more also in new construction, okay? Because a lot of times what's happening is already built stuff we call brownfield, things that are already operating, right? And I get it. That's a lot of what you have to go protect, and you got to go figure out how to do it. But that starting point needs to move all the way back to when you're building stuff in the beginning or you do a major modification. And that's a different world that hadn't traditionally looked at cyber. But when you build it in, which is when you're building the thing, it's a lot cheaper and better than when you bolt it on the other side. So you have to have this whole cyber asset lifecycle management, the whole thing that you look at. You're on both sides simultaneously. It's not either or. But this is an important part of the equation as well, because more and more companies, back to your point, are starting to look it earlier, right? Let's figure out how we actually put this in, because if we're going to have to deal with it, we want to put in like segmenting a network on an existing site. It's a huge pain. But if I can do it and built in, it's a lot cheaper and better to go do it then. So they're kind of cluing into that because there's a dollar and cents part to it if they need to do it anyway. But it's also being more proactive. It shows that they need to be more proactive. So at the end of the day, it's a mixed bag, but that's good. It's a mixed bag. And before it wasn't, right? It was like, oh, I found a client who actually is really caring about this. You're like, this is awesome. Let's go talk to the client. Now we're getting much more conversations, much more traction. How do I bring this earlier in our process? How do I get ahead of this challenge and more of a business reality? Again, is it perfect across the board? No, of course not. And there's still lots of times that people still bringing up air gaps and all sorts of fun stuff like that. Still happens. And there's a lot of education that has to happen. And your vision of the full fusion is there, but you got in its core nascent elements, we got to keep cultivating that along. But they're at least moving along the path. We're at least getting in the right direction. So that's good to have seen in the market as they go. Taking it more seriously.
Anyway, so one last one actually before I throw it back to Elliot. Resources and education around OT, IT, or the convergence. Do you have any suggestions? And if the answer is no, that's fine. We cut it. If the answer is yes, Elliot cuts me out and we go straight to the answer. I'm just curious. I only know of one thing that's been very critical to my path for understanding that, aside from just OJT. But ICS cert was a wealth of knowledge for me back in the day. I don't know how much of this they're still doing. So I'm kind of curious your take on if there is one for educating on the IT-OT convergence, or at least an IT guy trying to understand the OT or vice versa. What's a good place for either side of the coin to kind of figure out the other side?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. What I don't have is, man, this is the place. You really want to understand both. There's a location to go, and here's all the stuff you need to read. It's one-stop shop. You got it. Okay, I don't have. But you do have our sources, like whether you go to CISA resources there, you go to the different kinds of ISACs, and you go to some of the InfraGard stuff that you can go do. There's different pockets, I guess is where I'm saying, of where you can get information. We try to put out information as well, but a lot of sources, I guess is my point, are trying to put it in one. SANS has got some stuff as well. There's just different courses you can go to that are out there, but I haven't seen a seminal source that says, let's walk you through this. I think that's still in this primordial soup as we're trying to figure it out. Because I still think the IT and OT is trying to figure out the dynamic between themselves, right? And so where does that come? And much less how we put it all together. So I think it's one of those areas that is still, like everything else in our area, emerging and changing. But at least there's more conversations about it. And there are a few places you can collect bits of information versus I haven't seen one seminal source.
That's fair enough. I mean, you hit on my freaking primary source. So, Elliot, he's getting all my buzzwords today, all the good ones. So the ISACs, I'll foot stomp that one now just a little bit more. I work with a lot of ISACs and ISALs in my day-to-day job, so it makes me very giddy that you've mentioned those. I 100% agree. If you're part of any critical infrastructure or key resource as defined by DHS, there is an ISAC for you. If you're not part of one, there's probably still an ISAC or an ISAL for you. And yeah, I think for me that's probably one of the best places to get started. But yeah, 100% on that. Elliot, I'm gonna throw it back over to you, sir.
All right,
I truly don't have a whole heck of a lot to add to what Ian's saying. I mean, this would be a carbon copy of someone taking notes from me and turning them into something legible before I say them. So that this has been amazing, very in sync with what you're presenting. I have no questions about what you're discussing in respect to the nature of it. I love it. It's been great. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate it, Neal. Thank you very much.
I think that might be like one of the first large compliments a guest has ever had on our show. I could be wrong.
Right, I'm going to put that on my resume.
Well, if I was going to talk about, the topic right here is about what do you do to either A, avoid being breached, or B, post-breach in the sense of what we're doing. What do you do to prepare yourself for things? If I was to write down a list of keywords that I would want to talk with, you said them all before I even had to worry about it. So this has been awesome. I love it.
All right. Well, I do have one technical question. I feel like bits and pieces have definitely been touched on. So it's more of a scenario than a question. And there's definitely no one specific answer, at least in my mind. Uptime availability is obviously one of the largest or more important factors for the world that you're trying to protect. Say that there is an actual vulnerability of a high severity rank that does impact your ecosystem. How do you balance the sort of rapid response to repair that situation versus impact to availability?
Yeah, so if it's the vulnerability, not the actual active attack, because an active attack, you're in a whole different mode.
That's correct. Well, I mean, that vulnerability.
You've already broken the glass, stuff is happening, and
right.
Things are.
It could be exploited elsewhere.
Things are going boom, and you need to stop that. Okay, but you're talking about, oh boy, there's a big hole here. And you see that a lot. Look, we're going into clients that do have legacy systems. I've had places where they're high hazard equipment and they say, yeah, that thing is operating off MS-DOS. And we're like, did you say DOS? That's impressive. Okay. But it's a critical system. So they're saying, well, what do we do about it? I'm like, well, the short answer is not a quick answer, because you can't just rip and replace stuff. Okay. It's just not going to happen in that. But you also can't just leave a big glaring freaking vulnerability out there. So you got to put on your risk register, bang on that risk register and say, hey guys, we got to put some monitoring around that. We got to put some what are the compensating controls around that? Again, there's a list of stuff that you could do depending on what system and what's going on and what's there. So I can't give you a specific answer on that because it depends on the situation. But overall, you absolutely have to raise it. You raise it as a safety issue. Again, this is not, just stealing our data or IP. This is site safety. This is public safety. This is environmental safety. This is economic stability. Okay. And it's national security. So when you're hitting all those, because you're critical infrastructure, you usually can get some people's attention, especially if you say there's a whopping hole they can come through. Okay. That usually starts getting action, but you got to hit that on that safety and uptime, because it's going to hit both, right? But you hit those in a very business way and saying, this is what's going to do it on your risk. We got to go do it, but don't come with just the problem. Don't say, oh my God, what are we going to do? You have to come with a solution that makes sense to them, right? And if they have to make some hard decisions about shutting a plant down or having an unplanned shutdown, depends on the severity. Like, it all depends on what's going on with it and what you can do with a compensating control. But come with options. So here's the challenge. Here's the deal. This is what it means in business context. And here's what we want to go do about it. And here's the plan. And this is what we need from you guys. And if you break it down like that, that's the best you can do to address that issue.
All right.
I just summarized everything that an Intel analyst needs to remember to do when they're first getting started. Yeah. Don't complain about things unless you have a fix for things, or unless it truly is broken, something bad is happening, and you just need to pull the plug. Yeah, that's the fix. So courses of action are critical.
Yep.
Well, that takes us to the end of the episode. So, Ian, thank you so much for joining us, sharing a bit of your perspective, and helping us uncover a little bit of a topic that has definitely been on my wish list for a little bit. Neal, thank you as always for being our hype man, I guess. Maybe throwing a lot of compliments in here. But that is it. We will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to AZT, an independent podcast. Your hosts have been Neal Dennis and Elliot Volkman. To learn more about the series, catch past episodes, or about Zero Trust, go to adoptingzerotrust.com. You can also subscribe to our newsletter for additional insights. Viewpoints expressed during this show do not reflect the brands or employers of our hosts or guests.